A warm welcome from the rehearsal rooms of the Nationaltheater in Munich. My name is Christopher Warmuth. I'm a dramaturg at the Bayerische Staatsoper, and today I'm lucky enough to be talking to the two artists in charge of the new production of Johann Strauss, Die Fledermaus. The musical director of the production and general music director of the Bayerische Staatsoper, Vladimir Jurowski, and the director of the new production, Barry Kosky.
Thank you both for being here. I'm very happy to have you.
Okay, let's start by zooming out. Barry, who if not you, knows the genre of operetta so well? Not just because you have raised the profile of the Komische Oper in Berlin internationally with the Berlin Jazz Operettas, but because you yourself have staged more than 10 operettas in your career. The operetta genre is still, I would say, very rarely seen at the major opera houses. Die Fledermaus, the Bat is practically, I think, the only piece that is firmly anchored in the core repertoire. What do you think are the biggest misunderstandings of operetta, or, to put it bluntly, what tendentious cliches does the operetta struggle with?
Well, I have, in the last 12 years at the Komische Oper in Berlin, when I was Intendant, Chefregisseur, celebrated the art form of opera, particularly the jazz operas of the Berlin Weimar Republic, which are, in a way, the third great sort of manifestation of operetta, Offenbach, the Vienna's school of Strauss and Lehar, and then Berlin. I've celebrated it because I wanted to say to people that, firstly, it's in a genre itself, and secondly, that to direct, conceive, perform operetta is mostly harder than Wagner, Puccini, and Verdi. This is someone who directs a lot of Wagner, Puccini, and Verdi. It's easier to sing, but the Gesamtkunstwerk that is operetta, the dialogue, the dancing, the rhythm, how do you get the lightness, the sweetness in the music, but the drive? How do you combine all these elements? Is very hard to do if you don't have time, because you need rehearsal time, and you don't have time and talent. So you have to have people that can deliver musically, theatrically, and performatively what the genre requires. And the genre requires what the Americans in their musicals call triple threats, people that can dance, sing, and act. And the challenge to any, I think, director and conductor and performer is to balance what I call the two eyes in operetta. That is to say, one eye must be serious, but the other eye is winking at the audience and saying, this is fabulously ridiculous, isn't it? But we're having a great time. So this mixture of irony and non-irony is very important to operetta, and I think that it makes it very hard to do well. And it amazes me in the last 23 years of living in Europe why in the major operetta and opera houses the operetta repertoire is so small. Why is it? We did 10 operettas in Berlin that had never been performed in Berlin since the Weimar Republic, and they're masterpieces. And of course, Fledermaus is a fantastic piece. It's a great piece. It's a hard piece to do, but there are lots of other operettas. But I think people treat Fledermaus like Linus blanket, from Charlie Brown, that you have it for security. It reminds you of the good old times. And that makes it hard because you have to sort of take that blanket away and give it a good dry clean.
Vladimir, as a general music director of the Bayerische Staatsoper, it's important to you, on the one hand, to allow new pieces and thus other musical colors to become part of the institution's identity, I would say. I'm thinking of Die Nase, the Nose, Krieg und Frieden, War and Peace, or Die Passagierin, the Passenger. And at the same time, you are driven to keep the so-called crown jewels, the house gods of the Bayerische Staatsoper, alive. After Rosenkavalier and Cosi fan tutte, it's now time for Die Fledermaus. This piece has, I would say, quite an important tradition here, if I only think of Carlos Kleiber. What attracts you to Die Fledermaus?
I remember when I came to Glyndebourne and started working there as a music director back in 2000. One of my first wishes, which I extended to then still chairman George Christie, Sir George Christie, was to conduct Fledermaus. And George, who was a real, what would you say, Germanophile. Yes. He loved German art, particularly Wagner, but also Weber and Richard Strauss. Was a great connoisseur of opera. He said, Vladimir, you want to do operetta in Glyndebourne? And I said, well, George, I don't think Fledermaus is an operetta. I think it's an opera. Then later I discovered that George Christie was a big fan of Offenbach, and he actually much preferred Offenbach to Strauss because he found Offenbach wittier and more ironic. I think he must have had a Fledermaus trauma early in his youth when he went to study in Germany. He studied a lot after the war in Germany, and in those years the performances of Fledermaus were often dominated by rather questionable taste and were not always sung by the first class singers. Because the tradition before the war, before the Second World War, was a different one. But that tradition was lost in the 1940s, and it took a really long time until this great tradition of operetta playing was restored in Germany. And of course, it is connected to the two names, mainly Otto Schenk and Carlos Kleiber, who, although he has never been GMD of Bayerische Staatsoper, he was one of the permanent conductors here, and they made history with their Fledermaus. I would say it was not Karajan and none of the other world-famous conductors. It was Carlos Kleiber whose Fledermaus he put his stamp on the Fledermaus in the 1970s, and it remains a stamp which is still incredibly vivid and valid today. However, Carlos Kleiber unfortunately left this world back in 2004. Otto Schenk is still with us, but he doesn't stage anything, and we need to move on. Without forgetting that tradition, but I'd say we need to give it a new life. As I said, I did eventually do Fledermaus in Glyndebourne with an English director, Stephen Lawless, which was a very interesting mixture of European Germanic tradition and English stand-up comedy. I thought it was a very, very funny production. The critics hated it, but the audience loved it. And I also participated in a production of Fledermaus in the 90s. I was assistant conductor at the Komische Oper, and Harry Kupfer decided to stage Fledermaus for the 50th anniversary of the house. Back in 1947, Walter Felsenstein opened the house with a performance of Fledermaus, with Annie Schlemm in the role of Rosalinde. And 50 years later, Kupfer did his production, conducted by Jakob Kreitzberg, then chief conductor of the Komische Oper, and I was his assistant, so I took it over soon after Jakob. So these two experiences, the Komische Oper one and the Glyndebourne one, have informed my personal relationship with this piece. And of course I was completely enamored of the Kleiber recording of the 70s and 80s, and then I've also discovered there were many other variants of the Fledermaus which he conducted elsewhere. But I think what we are trying to create, it sounds now very, very grand and very, I don't want to make false promises, but we're trying to create a Fledermaus for the 21st century.
Mm-hmm.
Am I wrong?
Absolutely. I mean, we live in the 21st century as 21st century artists, but we are part of a tradition. And I think always in this art form of opera and operetta, that just to say I'm not interested in the past or interested in the past performances or how it was done or what was done before is I think dangerous. You always have to be aware of the past, excavate the past, but then you have to say, well, that's what we think now. And in my operetta productions in Berlin and here in Munich, I've done the same thing in the sense that, you know, if it is a masterpiece like Fledermaus, the dialogues don't have to be rewritten. That we have to just maybe cut here and there, which we have done, but we're not rewriting the piece. Also, the operetta, you know, it's very interesting. The operetta has to be a sort of theatrical world. I don't think the pieces work if you just do them historically. Then they become very dusty. And I don't think the pieces work if you go one-to-one contemporary. You know, we've been talking for the last 2 weeks of saying I've seen enough Fledermauses where they've done contemporary and the second act makes no sense because there's flashing disco lights on a disco floor, but there's all these waltzes and Strauss music, and it looks and sounds ridiculous, in my opinion. So you have to find a way to honor that tradition, but break it simultaneously and say this is something new. But I think that's exciting. And in particular, I think in this house, we had the same situation when we did Rosenkavalier, where we had Schenk and Kleiber, the shadow of that Rosenkavalier. And I never wanted to say this production, you know, has a use-by date now, and we throw it away and we do a new show. No, that was one production. It served its purpose, exactly like in the Fledermaus production. And the Schenk Kleiber version is fantastic for its time. It's wonderfully directed by Schenk. It has pace, it has rhythm, it has everything you want in an operetta performance. But they're not
it is
here now.
of its time.
And I think we want to say to an audience that, you know, Fledermaus, like any famous piece, has its cliches, has its iconic moments, has its, you know, dangerous moments where people expect or, you know, dream of seeing that again. But I think in the sense of Fledermaus, in a way, Fledermaus for me is easier to do here in Munich than Rosenkavalier. I was a little bit scared of Rosenkavalier about coming into to this iconic production, and maybe because we did it during Corona time, the pressure was away somehow. And I was very, very happy with the results. But when we're down doing Fledermaus here, this is a different piece, different time. I mean, I've done enough operetta to know how to do them. And even though Fledermaus is very different, of course, from the Berlin Weimar Republic operettas, and I've resisted doing a production because I've struggled with the piece at times. You know, my first role Fledermaus was Joan Sutherland in the Sydney Opera House, and Joan Sutherland was fabulous. She was no Rosalinda. The dialogues, but that was the first experience of the piece, and I would only in a way do it here in Munich with Vladimir. You know, someone said to me, I wouldn't do Fledermaus in Berlin. I decided not to do it. So when Vladimir and Serge Dorny asked me to do it here, I said, well, yes, after Rosenkavalier, it makes perfect sense to do now Fledermaus in the Bayerische Staatsoper with Vladimir and the orchestra and chorus here.
So let's talk about the Fledermaus and the reading of your piece now, the Fledermaus in the 21st century. In the rehearsals, you both talked a lot about a Greek god right from the start, Dionysos. Why is your Fleming plea for the Dionysian so relevant for the new production?
Do you want to go first?
Well, Dionysus is the god of theater, and Dionysus is the god of ecstasy. Obviously, we being men of theater, we adore Dionysus, and this music. This is interesting because Fledermaus, I've said it before, is a piece where you find almost no sympathetic character. They're all horrible people. and they're definitely horrible to each other. However bad you are, however flawed you are still a mortal. And being a mortal makes you equal to all the other people, to all the righteous people in this world, because everyone must die. And as long as one is alive, one is here to enjoy the life. And Fledermaus has got this enormous joy drug potential. It's in the music. It's not so much in the text, although you can find it in the text as well. For instance, this intro chorus for the second act, the first number in which the chorus appears, they speak about Traumgebild, about these dream-like appearances which make you hallucinate. So the piece has got a hallucinatory quality, not only the social critical quality and the parodistic quality, which is also there. And I think the music is of such high level throughout. There is not one note of bad music, which is a real enigma to me, because most operettas, even the most famous of them, I don't want to name them, but you know them, all the Offenbachs and Lehars, they've got their great numbers, and then there are also less great numbers, and there is also a little bit of rubbish sprinkled here and there. There is no rubbish in the Fledermaus, nothing. Every single note, and not only in its initial idea, but also in its realization. Because the orchestration of Strauss, I've said it before and I have to say it again, is on the level of Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. And if Richard Strauss learned anything about orchestration, he didn't learn it from Wagner, he learned it from Johann Strauss.
Barry, the second act in the piece is particularly building towards excess. We start off relatively bourgeois in Vienna before diving into the world of Prince Orlowski. You refer several times to the ancient Greeks' understanding of theater.
Yeah. When we're dealing with operetta, we always have to go right back to the ancient Greek theater to remind ourselves that for the ancient Greek playwrights and for the ancient Greek audiences, it was very important after the day of the trilogy, because they were written, all the plays were written as trilogies there, for the competitions, and this goes for Euripides, Aeschylus, Sophocles, all of them, that at the end of the story of the House of Atreus or Oedipus, there was always this satyr play, the comedy play. And that was a shorter piece with ludicrous costumes, enormous phalluses, which we know about from the vases and the friezes of ancient Greece. Outrageously childish jokes about urinating, farting, having sex, crude, vulgar, obscene, funny, as a sort of antidote to Clytemnestra, Antigone, Oedipus. And it was a brilliant invention because they wanted to send the people away not going, life is meaningless, but a sense of, Vladimir was saying that we are alive. We are still alive. And that was the starting point of it. The entire tradition of stage comedy, which then took in commedia dell'arte. That was the next great invention of the Italians, where we got basically most of our ingredients for comedy from commedia dell'arte. The husband, wife, this all comes from Italian clowning. And then in the 19th century, 20th century, we had Feydeau, we had all of this, and the operetta was part of this tradition. And I think for me, that the first, we sort of, if there's a date, like we say Monteverdi's L'Orfeo, that was the beginning of it. There is a similar date in operetta. We say that's Orpheus. ironically enough, both Orpheus' stories. The birth of opera by Monteverdi used the Orfeo myth, and the birth of operetta used the Orfeo myth. I think that's not a mistake, or not an accident, I'm sorry. I think that's fascinating, though. But what did Offenbach do? He twisted the whole thing. At the end of it, Eurydice does not want to go back with Orpheus and does not want to stay in the underworld. She wants to fly in the arms of Bacchus, Dionysus. And this is at the very beginning of the operetta tradition, that we have a character, Eurydice, running into the arms of Dionysus, which I think operetta has done ever since. It's literally run into the arms of Dionysus. And I think for me, it's done differently. French Dionysius is different from Viennese Dionysius. And Viennese Dionysius is very different from Berlin Dionysius. And I think what Strauss did is, which I find very fascinating, is that he made it, the marriage, even more bourgeois and even more petty and hypocritical, because marriage is the thing that operetta laughs at right through the history of it. That's the center point. Heterosexual marriage, the hypocrisy, the disguises, the intrigues, the lies, all of that is ripped apart mostly in the second act of operettas. And it's ripped apart by Dionysius. He goes, boom. In the case of Fledermaus, it's champagne is the drug. Champagne is the crystal meth of the 19th century. And so champagne is the conduit in which you drink, imbibe this fluid, and Dionysius will come out like a genie. We've got to understand that the waltz itself, we associate with such an elegant, it's always very elegant, but the waltz itself, this perpetual 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, is actually a Dionysian rhythm. It's not a charming, elegant thing. The waltz is a spiral, a delirium spiral.
And there's also an insane energy, a desire to change. People use alcohol in the piece because they are either not entirely satisfied with the reality of their lives, or they want to break out of this reality of their lives. They all have, we could say in a way, desires, longings that they want to satisfy. Barry, how different is this bourgeois Viennese society from what is happening next? And why do these two opposites work so strongly in the piece?
Well, I think, as I said, firstly, I think it's historically and dramaturgically, that's a thread that goes through all of the operetta tradition. That's sort of the bourgeois marriage. What's brilliant about Fledermaus is that Eisenstein and Rosalinda, as Vladimir just said, are not particularly likable. I would call them charming monsters. Mm-hmm. Charming monsters. And this makes it very, very interesting because you don't really feel sorry for anybody in Fledermaus, particularly not Eisenstein, because he behaves so appallingly in the course of the entire opera. And I think this wonderfully verklempt, sort of bourgeois, middle-class Viennese hell is something that both Eisenstein and Rosalinda want to get out of. What's forgotten a lot, because that's cut out a lot in a lot of versions, is that Rosalinda was an operetta singer before she met Eisenstein. So she used to go in the province on tours in the Balaton or whatever, where she met Alfred and where they performed. And I think that this is very interesting because this means Rosalinda is a performer. She's got talent. She's just not going to the second act just in a disguise. It's a performance. And I think that what you have in the second act of Fledermaus is this wonderful thing where through champagne and through waltz and through the Dionysian Rausch, the facades come off, the clothes come off, the mask comes off. And what are we left with? Flawed human beings, I think.
Can you share us something about your fascination with the 20th century theater groups, the Cockettes, which are playing quite a big role in the second act.
One of the great challenges of any Fledermaus is, what sort of ball is it? What sort of party is it? Now, if you look at the tradition of 19th century balls, they were outrageous. And a lot of the balls were costume balls. A lot of sex happened at the balls. We're talking 19th century. A lot of young women, ballerinas, were at the balls. It was a release. And I thought what I wanted to do was to somehow create a world which was unique to the stage, because it takes place on the stage, to combine images of 19th century bordellos and 19th century transvestitism and 19th century sort of circus with the Cockettes, who were a performance group in San Francisco in the 70s. A brilliant, radical, highly influential group of artists who created this sort of burlesque vaudeville drag, which they used bits and pieces of all sorts of historical costumes and new costumes and makeup. And I wanted to collide that world, because it's very Dionysian in the San Francisco sense, with the sort of world in the 19th century. And we create a new world. And I think we're probably the first production in the history of music theatre to combine 19th century Viennese underwear and images of 19th century bordellos with the Cockettes. And it makes, I think, a sort of fabulous, outrageous, strange, weird, wonderful world. And a contrast to that living room in the first act. Because it's not by accident. The settings are very important. Living room, confined, prison. They get released from the prison of domesticity into the Dionysian delirium, and then end up in a real prison. We have collaged many associations to create a space in which living room, party, and prison can all be connected by the same images. And the production should float and dream and sort of waltz its way through the 3 hours. That's our intention.
Waltzing through, that will be your task on the evening, Vladimir. It is always super fascinating to watch conductors performing the Fledermaus. At its best, it looks super light, so yeah, I would say dance-like, but it certainly seems more like letting go than it actually is, doesn't it?
There is a famous saying of Wilhelm Furtwängler, who once remarked that it is much easier to conduct Bruckner's 7th Symphony or 9th Symphony with the Berlin Philharmonic Orchestra than conduct a Gräfin Maritza with a Kurkapelle of Bad such and such. Here, of course, we've got a world-class orchestra playing this music, but still, in our profession, operetta, and particularly Viennese operetta, is considered among the hardest things to conduct. And conducting waltz is probably the key to all these difficulties, because, as Barry already said, it's unstable. The 1, 2, 3 creates a lack of stability, and I would say it's a centrifugal power which escapes the center, and it's all to do with how the waltz came into existence as a Gesellschaftstanz, as a society dance, because as a dance it existed already since the end of 16th century. There were various forms of Walzer. But Walzer, which came into existence in Vienna in the 19th century, is closely connected to the times of great repressions and depressions after the end of Napoleonic Wars. So there was a Vienna Congress, which brought the end to all liberal thought in Europe. It was forbidden to long for freedom. It was forbidden, many things were forbidden. Plus, the private life was also very rigidly controlled by the church and by the state, by the moral codex. So the waltz, being what it is, where a man and a woman are standing very, very close by each other and are holding each other almost in an embrace. So that in itself was already an outrageous thing. Plus, the fact that they circle themselves, not seeing anyone but looking into each other's eyes, makes them become a bubble, which can, in an idealistic vision, lose the ground under their feet and escape the world. So it is a vehicle of escapism. Waltz is also a kind of a drug which helps people escaping their reality. And conducting waltz, meaning giving an initial spin, but then allowing it to take its own course, especially if we think that there's a French waltz and the Viennese waltz. The French waltz is a straight succession of 3 beats, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. The Viennese waltz has a succession of a downbeat, we call it, the initial impulse, then an early second beat, an anticipated second beat, and then a rather late third beat. So you have 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, which makes your head spin. Mm-hmm. It's impossible to calculate. So the hardest thing for an orchestra, which is not Viennese and does not have this tradition, is how to play this accompaniment, because the people in the orchestra who play the first note are usually the cellos and basses, and let's say bassoons, maybe trombones. But then there are people who are only playing 2 and 3. The second violins, violas, clarinets, horns, the tsa, 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 tsa. And if they don't know how to do it, it's an impossible thing to teach. But once they know how to do it, the conductor's job is to set the initial spin and then let them do it. So I think it's all about mixing control and release. But if you watch Carlos Kleiber, if you closely watch Carlos Kleiber, he was a genius at feigning freedom, where everything was strict calculation and control. And if you speak to people who played under his conducting guidance, they will mostly report the same thing. He would always have it just one way, the way he heard it, which is must have been a traumatizing experience for him, always having to work with people who didn't know what he wanted and could not feel the same thing. But once an orchestra eventually, and this orchestra is a brilliant example because they worked so much with him, they learned to read his mind. And if you hear how they make music together with this Fledermaus, and there are various versions of the Fledermaus, there's live Fledermaus, there's a studio recording, then you understand they really read his mind. And then he probably, while conducting them, he was able to just let it go. However, having said that, in a performance, and especially in such a complex performance, where it's not just the music, it's the stage, it's the dancers, you have to be in a permanent state of control, unfortunately. It's fun, but it's hard work.
Mm-hmm. One of the hardest works in a piece like the Fledermaus is to get also the dialogues on the right temperature level. I think the temperature in the Munich production was quite high. I remember that you once said, Barry, in the rehearsals, if people from the outside, from the normal world, would see how everybody is behaving on stage, it would be a bit, they would be a bit concerned because of the playfulness and childishness of the actors and singers. How do you get in the work with a piece like the Fledermaus to the point that the dialogues are having the tempo and having the fun that they need, and not that they are not being like chewing gum at the end?
Well, that's the work. You know, that's what we say in German, Knochenarbeit. That's the hard work. And I think that I use the same process. If you have a good talented people and you have a text, for example, the first, you have to go quickly into it and find out what it is, where could be the jokes, what's funny, what's not funny, what's the feel of the scene, what's the dilemma of the scene. Once you've found that, which is very subjective, you then have to immediately remove yourself from that fun and completely take apart the situation and characterization to find the right timing. And the timing is like a partitur. And so in the dialogues, when people see my productions in Berlin and hopefully here, the dialogues are just as much a partitur as what the orchestra and the singers are singing, in a different way. That means it has to feel natural, but it's not. But comedy actually has to be rehearsed quite seriously, in the sense that this timing thing is it's a technical thing. And it's about beats. It's about opening the door, shutting the door, and then the text. And it's sounds, and it's movement. But I love this. This is part of the fun. But you can't do it hypothetically before the rehearsals. And you can't direct it by saying, do this. It has to come from the people that are there in the room. And we've got a great bunch of clowns, because essentially comedy is impossible if you don't have clowning. And to have clowning, you have people that are very childish. All the great actors of any generation are all childish clowns, because only great actors can be childish clowns, and only childish clowns can be great actors. And it's a very important part of theatrical process, is the childlike fun of creating. Spaß is not a dirty word. Fun is not a dirty word in the rehearsal process, because make-believe and invention should have a childlike innocence to it. And, you know, I love watching 65-year-old actors or opera singers behave like 10-year-olds in a rehearsal room. It gives me nothing but joy.
The energy level, especially in the dialogues between the musical numbers, is sometimes in a way kept even higher by you putting stage music under the dialogues. But why is this music also so important in terms of scenery and content?
Well, it was Barry's wish and idea, but we had it also done in Glyndebourne. Was slightly different production, was a different style, but we had a quartet playing, and I think it's correct if we imagine it's happening at the party. It's never quiet at the parties, and you never hear. You've been at parties where you can barely hear your own voice, and trying to converse with another person is actually costs you a big effort. In the Fledermaus, the big problem is that usually there's dead silence while someone is speaking, and it doesn't look or sound like a party. But then, of course, if you invite a chorus to do the chatting, then you won't hear anything, even if you amplify the singers. So we decided that instead of that, we would just put some music as a background.
After 35 years of directing opera, these things come very easy to me. The dialogues are where the fun for me is, where the challenge is for me. Ooh, it's like a puzzle. How can I get that right? That's what I love about operetta, you know, because the numbers take care of themselves in most contexts. And as I said, I can do that. But the dialogues need work and fantasy and virtuosity. And I think it's always hilarious when you see these operetta productions in big houses or particularly Fledermaus productions, it can feel longer than the slowest Götterdämmerung. It really can, because the music will stop. The opera singer who's had 2 days to rehearse it will say, "Ah, Rosalinda, ah," and they will be done at a snail's pace. And I think it's so important that people don't feel that when the music ends, it's time for a pause in the audience while we wait for the next musical number. Because the operetta, the evening won't function like that, because so much of the drama is actually in the dialogue. So it's a challenge, and it's fun. It's scary sometimes. And God help us if anyone gets sick and we have to have an Einspringer, because it's virtually impossible.
If you read the cast list for the evening, there might be one chance with an Einspringer, with illness, because you might still think with 6 times of the Frosch, there is a possibility that there are 5 left to save the part in case of illness. What's the deal with the 6 times Frosch, the role?
Well, Frosch is another challenge. There've been brilliant Frosches on stage, particularly in the German-speaking world. Very famous, brilliant comedians. We have to remember this tradition of the Frosch monologue is not coming from Strauss. This was a later addition. There's a very specific dialogue with Frosch at the beginning of the 3rd act in the original text. But the tradition of the comic, making contemporary jokes, whatever, is a very new phenomenon. On the whole, I find it a little bit tedious. It comes in the evening where you want to move things along. And it comes always with a sense of, is watching a drunk man that funny anymore? And I've always found that then the turning around and making sort of contemporary jokes about politicians and media stars and film stars to be a little bit on the border of my taste levels. And I wanted to find a new way of doing it. So as you see, as you said, on the cast list, we have Frosch 1, Frosch 2, Frosch 3, Frosch 4, Frosch 5, and Frosch 6. There's a dancing Frosch. And that came from actually a line later in the act where Frank says, "Oh, I'm so drunk that I see 2 of you." In my production, he sees 6 of them. I'll say no more. The audiences will have to experience it.
I think with that open ending, everybody of the audience needs to figure out by themselves how many Frosches they will see on that evening. Thank you both, Vladimir Jurovsky and Barry Kosky, very much for taking the time and telling us a bit more about the ideas behind the production, about the Dionysian aspect, about the bourgeoisie, about Vienna in the 19th century, and of course about Strauss. Thank you both very much.
Pleasure.
And with that, we say goodbye to you from the Bayerische Staatsoper. Glücklich ist, wer's vergisst. Happy is who forgets. I hope this core sentence applies to a lot except for the new Fledermaus at the Bayerische Staatsoper. See you again, hopefully soon in Munich.